Усім привіт! Мене звуть Федір Попадюк, і це подкаст «Кляті Питання». Цим епізодом я повертаю цього року подкаст теми, які не пов'язані з війною, бойовими діями та зброєю, про які ми, власне, говоримо з паном Євгеном Будерацьким, хоча так чи інакше будуть стосуватися війни, бо Росія не зникла і, власне, війна ще триває. До речі, я можу робити більше завдяки вам та вашій підтримці української правди, яку ви надаєте, стаючи членами клубу УП. Тому, якщо ви хочете, щоб я робив ще більше подкастів, долучайтеся до клубу, вам буде щастя прослуховувати подкасти, а мені буде щастя від того, що ви їх слухаєте. Перш ніж ми перейдемо до нашої гості, хочу озвучити кілька неприємних фактів, про які ви, можливо, не знали, і за які мені, як чоловіку, м'яко кажучи, незручно, хоча я не маю стосунку до жодного з них. Кожна третя жінка, яка звертається на гарячі лінії підтримки в Україні, потерпає від насильства з боку інтимного партнера. Скільки жінок, які потерпають від різних видів насильства – фізичного, сексуального, економічного чи психологічного, але нікому про це не кажуть – невідомо. За 2023 рік до Національної поліції України надійшло 216 284 звернення, пов'язаних з домашнім насильством. І знову ж, ця цифра не відповідає реальній картині, бо ми говоримо лише про тих, хто звертається у поліцію. Якщо казати загалом, у 2023 році 3,6 мільйона українців потребували доступу до послуг із запобігання та реагування на гендерно зумовлене насильство. 90% з них – жінки та дівчата. Теми гендерно зумовленого насильства і буде стосуватися цей епізод. І нагадаю, що це вже не перший епізод на цю тему. Я якось записував подкаст про Стамбульську конвенцію, прийняту у 2022 році, і її важливість для України. Можете прислухати, якщо є можливість, щоб зрозуміти, чому наше законодавство має змінюватися, щоб запобігати домашньому насильству і гендерно зумовленому насильству. А на цю тему ми будемо говорити сьогодні з Sabine Fraser, представницею ООН «Жінки в Україні». Ми обговоримо, чому відбувається гендерно зумовлене насильство, як на нього впливає війна та як йому запобігти. Також важливо сказати, що цей епізод буде записано в межах проєкту EU for Recovery – розширення можливостей громад в Україні, який впроваджується ООН «Жінки в Україні» за підтримки Європейського Союзу. Ну а тепер давайте слухати. Пані Сабін, вітаю. Дуже раді бачити в нашій студії. Я вас покликав поговорити про гендерно зумовлене насильство, бо ця тема є важливою і в Україні, і особливо в Україні під час війни. При цьому ця тема є дуже важливою як для жінок, так і для чоловіків. А моє перше питання буде стосуватися термінології. Хотів розпитати вас про корені та походження терміну гендерно зумовлене насильство і взагалі феномен цього явища. І окремо хотів запитати, які саме фактори сприяють виникненню цього явища.
Thank you very much, Fyodor, for having me on today. It's a great honor to be on this podcast and to be able to speak to you today about this very important issue of gender-based violence. I appreciate that your listeners have tuned in to listen to this topic at the beginning of the year. So first I want to say a big Happy New Year to the listeners. Of course, we're in a very difficult time for Ukraine with the large-scale aggression by the Russian Federation, who is now almost entering its third year. So I want to start by saying, a tremendous condolences to those who have been negatively affected by the war. And I think that this topic of gender-based violence is very closely linked to the current situation in Ukraine. And of course, it is very important to talk about the different forms of violence which are unfortunately currently affecting men, women, boys and girls in the country. So thank you for this invitation. I think that gender-based violence is unfortunately something that is very prevalent, which is very common throughout the world. And what we find is that approximately 1 out of every 3 women around the world say that they have been affected by gender-based violence at some point in their lives. So this is really a problem which is global. Millions and millions of women are affected by this every year. And so you asked me what is the issue with gender-based violence, what is the root of this term. And I want to also explain that there's sometimes a difference of terminology between gender-based violence and violence against women. So gender-based violence is not only violence against women, but it's violence that is used against people of different genders. So of course it's men and women. It's also the LGBTIQ plus community. And it is people that are attacked specifically because of their gender. So in certain cases that can be men as well, that men may be attacked because they're men. But what we see very often is that the root causes of gender-based violence are very much often based on power relations. So it's very often that one party, one side, feels that it has stronger power because of its gender and then can attack the other. So that's why, of course, the majority of the cases are of violence against women, because it is a situation in the majority of cases where it is men that feel that they have power over women so that they can use violence against them. The other thing that's important to remember is that when we're talking about violence, it's not only physical violence. So often when we think about gender-based violence, we think particularly about domestic violence. We think particularly about violence in the home where the husband or the partner is hitting his wife or his partner. But it's not only that. It can also be forms of psychological violence. So it can be also constantly telling somebody that they're negative, that they're inferior, that they're not smart enough, that they're not quick enough. So it can be psychological forms of violence. It can also even be economic forms of violence. So, for example, in a situation in a family where, let's say, the man and the women are both working, but all the salary of the family is held in the hands, let's say, of the husband. So let's say the woman does work, but when she comes home from work, she has to give the money to the husband. That can be economic forms of violence if it's something that the woman is not really in favor of, but she feels forced that she has to give financial support. So there are different forms of violence that fall under gender-based violence. And one thing that is very much coming up now today in Ukraine, but also throughout the world, is also cyber violence. So is also violence that exists on social media. And I'm sure that many of your listeners are quite familiar to the type of violence that you see on the different social media platforms that use it.
В Інстаграмі та Твіттері.
Exactly, on Instagram, on Twitter. And so what we're really seeing there is increases of that type of violence as well, where you may get death threats on social media, you may get threats against family members, financial threats. So there's a whole world now also of cyber violence and online violence, which is increasingly becoming a big concern.
Говорячи про ситуацію з насильством і гендерно зумовленим насильством в Україні, наскільки наша ситуація погана і відрізняється від інших країн?
So, as I said, unfortunately, gender-based violence is very much a global phenomenon. And I would say that Ukraine is in some ways kind of, an average situation. It's not better than other countries, and it's not really worse than other countries. Of course, the fact that we have a large-scale aggression by the Russian Federation means that we have specific forms of violence which are related to the war. So here, the one form of violence which unfortunately we have seen happen in Ukraine since 2014, but also now, of course, since 2022, is conflict-related sexual violence. So that is violence that is used within the context of the conflict, within the context of the war, as a way to terrorize the population, to try to win the war, to try to defeat the other side. So unfortunately, what we've seen is that Russia has used conflict-related sexual violence against the Ukrainian people. And here, just since the start of the large-scale aggression in 2022, what we've seen is that the numbers have been quite significant. And so in September of 2023, the Office of the Prosecutor General identified 231 cases of conflict-related sexual violence. So 231 cases where there was evidence and a tremendous amount of information was available to show that Russian forces had used violence against Ukrainians in a intention to make gains in the conflict. What's interesting here also is that of those victims, so as I said, 231, 82 of them are men, and 12 of them are girls, and one of them is a boy. And so the rest of them, of about 149, are women. So what we're seeing here is quite a large number of men being also victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So what we're seeing is that sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war against men and women. And of course, these cases are very different. Some of them may have happened in detention. Some of them may have happened in personal homes. They may have happened in the street. So there are many different incidents of conflict-related sexual violence. So this is one thing which is, of course, very characteristic about Ukraine and the current situation, is that we have this. So I'd be happy to talk more about conflict-related sexual violence. But before I get more into the details of that, I would say that, of course, the general war situation makes violence more prevalent in society. So it makes it more common in society in general. So what we're seeing today is that for the first 9 months of 2023, the police received, listen carefully here, the police received 243,980 cases, so almost 245,000 cases of complaints of gender-based violence in 2023. So that is, a very quite a significant number. It is pretty similar to the numbers of 2020 and 2021. One thing that is good about that number is that it shows that people are willing to trust the police, willing to trust the government to report on these cases. Because very often what we see in many contexts is that people don't trust the police, so they don't report. Very often gender-based violence is silent violence because people don't talk about it. Here in Ukraine, 243,980,000 cases. What we're seeing is that people are reporting, and what we're also seeing is that the government is taking this as a real problem, that the police are really increasing their capacities, their abilities to respond, that these cases, some of them are going to court, that there are clear laws against gender-based violence, and that we are seeing justice. So we're also seeing that some of these cases are being prosecuted and people are being put in jail for having committed these forms of violence. So I would say that you were asking me kind of if I compare Ukraine with other countries. I mean, clearly Ukraine is different because it's in a war situation. It has this conflict-related sexual violence, but it also has an overall violence in the society, which mean that there are also, a large number of cases also that are within the family, that are within the communities, which unfortunately we're seeing as well.
Так, на мою думку, це говорить про те, що ми ще не Швейцарія, але на шляху формування нашого суспільства вже не Росія. Говорячи про нерівність та наслідки насильства, хотілося запитати, які можуть бути, власне, наслідки для суспільства, якщо насильство ґрунтується на нерівності.
The situation with violence is that it's not only a personal relationship between a man and a woman, or between two men, or between two partners that where the violence has an effect. As you said, the violence has a ripple effect on society. So of course the violence will have a ripple effect within the family. So the violence will have an effect with the children, with the parents, with different family members. But also the violence has an effect on the community, on the neighbors that hear it, on the community members that know about it. But also the violence has an economic effect, because what this means is that services need to be put in place to ensure that survivors of violence are supported. It also means that people that are victims of violence will have perhaps more difficulty in holding a job, in participating in economic life. They will need more medical care. They will need more police support eventually, support from the court system. So there's definitely an economic cost to this violence. And one thing that's also extremely tragic about violence, particularly in the family, is that it often is inherited. So very often what ends up happening is that if a child faces violence at home, it will sometimes cause a certain normalization that the child will think, but this is how it is. And then that violence will be replicated once that child gets older. So this is also very bad, that it's a kind of vicious circle that unfortunately requires really increasing awareness about how negative violence is to ensure that all of society understands that violence is bad. Because there still tends to be a feeling in many environments that, violence is a private matter. It just happens in the family, or it's just a little tap. It's nothing serious. This is what needs to be addressed, and that even the smallest forms of violence have to be recognized as problematic because they can very quickly inflate into something much more serious.
Як можна розірвати це коло? Бо, як я розумію, діти бачать насильство в сім'ї, потім виростають і самі чинять насильство. Плюс є частина суспільства, для якої насильство є нормою. Як можна цього уникнути?
So, thank you, Fedor, for that question, because I think that breaking the cycle of violence is a real challenge. And again, this is a global problem. It's not only in Ukraine. As we, already discussed at the beginning, there are root causes of violence. So a lot of it has to do with inequality between men and women. It has to do with power relations. So first of all, it's extremely important that a society understands that men and women are equal, that LGBTIQ plus groups are also equal, so that there is the sense that there's no one group that has more power than the other, that they have the right, some reason, to use violence, or that they have the right to feel more powerful, stronger than the others. So equality is very much at the root solution. You need to have equality to be able to address violence for over the long term. But in addition to that, so gender equality is extremely important. As I said, awareness is extremely important. So it's very important that everyone understands that violence is wrong, and that any level of violence is wrong. And as I explained at the beginning, the violence can be different forms. It can be economic, it can be psychological, and so on. It's also really important that because a lot of the violence tends to be against women, and it tends to be really violence against women, it's very important that efforts are put into place to support women so that they can have equal positions as men. So that can be in economic life. So it's to ensure, for example, that women have equal access to jobs, that they have equal access to equal pay, that they feel, in economic life that they can do the same jobs as men. That there aren't areas that are closed off to them. And same thing for political life. It's extremely important that when we look at decision-making, that women are also in decision-making positions. Really what one needs to aspire to is equality in decision-making. So really having equal number of men and women in parliament, equal number of men and women in the cabinet, in local councils. So all of this work on achieving equality is very important to be able to eliminate violence against women. But what I would say as well is that, of course, what is also very important is that services are put in place so that if you are a victim of violence, that you have the proper support that you need, the medical support, the legal support, the psychological support. And so if you get back to your question about, what to do about children, for example, that live in a violent family, it's very important that a lot of effort be put to support those children. That they receive psychological counseling, that they receive information so that they don't feel guilty. Because very often children that live in a violent family, they will feel like it's their fault. They will feel like, oh my goodness, mom and dad are fighting and it's my fault. So that also needs to be broken, and the children have to also receive a tremendous amount of support to once again feel confident enough and understanding enough of what a healthy environment looks like.
Так, я думаю, ми маємо інвестувати в наших дітей і пояснювати їм ці правила, як має проявлятися рівність, тому що в майбутньому вони можуть змінити ситуацію і зробити світ справедливішим для кожного та кожної. І ще хотів запитати, чи мають чоловіки просувати питання гендерної рівності і які переваги гендерної рівності для чоловіків?
So thanks very much, Fedir, for asking me that question about the role of men, and also to kind of continue with what we were discussing about the role of children. I also want to put a focus on the role of teenagers. I myself have 2 teenagers. I also have a boy and a girl at home, and it's very interesting because it's when you're a teenager that the gender roles become so clear. And here, in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the world, including in Europe, unfortunately, there are a lot of very traditional gender roles that our teenagers see, and that they start to believe in as being essential. So, you see it in movies, you see it on TV, you see it in social media, on TikTok, how, these gender roles are perpetuated through these various forms of media, which really have a very strong effect, I think, particularly on teenagers. And unfortunately, many of these roles are really reinforcing the differences between men and boys and girls, and really reaffirming that somehow boys are stronger, that they have physical force, and that girls are meant to be pretty, they're meant to be fashionable, and that they're a little bit weaker. So unfortunately, we see this kind of, as I say, everywhere around the world. And that is also something I think that, is important for teenagers also to see beyond that, to also understand that these are roles that are being projected to them, but that are not the basis of truth if you want to have an equal society. So here, I think the role of men and boys is extremely important. So it's extremely important for men and boys to see beyond those gender stereotypes, to see beyond those images that are being projected to them. And unfortunately, it's everywhere, right? Even if you look at a commercial, you see a commercial where, they're selling, let's say, cleaning products, and it's going to be the woman who's doing the vacuuming, and it's the man who's sitting back and sitting on the sofa and waiting for the coffee to be delivered to him.
Але з моєї точки зору ситуація стала набагато кращою. Я якось дивився стару американську рекламу 50-х-60-х років, і це було жахливо. Власне, тут відчувається, що суспільство дуже змінилося.
So excellent. If you're seeing some changes in advertising, that's really good. I think there's still plenty of stereotypes in advertising, but actually, as UN Women, this is one of the things that we do, actually. We work with advertising companies to try to help them analyze their own advertising to understand the prejudice that they have in the advertising and try to reverse it. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of funny now advertising where the gender roles are reversed and that really try to sell the product, but also show that more equal society.
Буває, дивишся фільм і думаєш, боже, як таке можливо? Отже, ви щойно розповіли про підлітків, а давайте ще поговоримо про чоловіків. Як ми можемо змінювати ситуацію і досягати збільшення рівних прав? Адже в багатьох країнах досі є патріархальні суспільства.
So, I mean, men and boys. So the issue with, what we've clearly understood as kind of UN Women and as an organization that has the name women in it, UN Women, we also recognize that it's absolutely essential to work with men and boys. It's absolutely essential for, men, women, boys, girls, LGBTIQ plus groups to understand that it's about equality for all. So working with men, one thing that we do, for example, we work with what we call men champions. So we have a project called He for She. So this is a global project, and it exists in schools, but it also exists in politics. It exists in various forms. So it's really to have men champions that declare themselves as working on he for she. So there are many politicians that are he for she champions, including here in Ukraine. I believe Kuleba, the foreign minister, is a he for she champion, as are other members of the government. And we, globally, they're different he for she champions. I should also say that he for she can also be something done, by companies. by sports teams. I was living before in Turkey, and for example, the football team Fenerbahce football is a he for she champion, so they put on their jerseys he for she. So you have men football players who are promoting he for she. So I think that this is important because it shows that men are in solidarity with women and that are really trying to do something to bring back gender equality. So that's one way of doing it. But I would also say that for men, it's very important not to feel scared to be a he for she champion or to be a feminist. You have there's sometimes this feeling that, oh yeah, this is a woman problem. This is something, yeah, women feminists. But no, you can be a man and a feminist as well, because it's about equality and believing in equality and believing in women's empowerment. So we also see some men who take up that profile and say, I'm a feminist and I'm proud. But we also work, for example, closely with the private sector, with companies, and so here we have companies that are run by men that also say, okay, I'm a corporation and I want to ensure that inside my company there's equality. I want to ensure that, for example, there's hiring that is equal, that there's pay that is equal, that there's paternity leave that exists in my company. So you can also have men in the private sector who say, I'm going to make an effort on this. So there are lots of different ways that men can get engaged and that they can really support gender equality, which ultimately gets to the point which will help reduce violence.
Так, тому що це велика проблема. Я знаю багатьох дівчат, які чули при прийомі на роботу фрази про те, що от через півроку ви завагітнієте і нам доведеться шукати когось ще.
Can I say that that's a huge problem? So the issue of maternity leave is that I mean, that's not even about stereotypes. I mean, you can be a business owner and just make a rational consideration and think, why would I hire this young woman because I know she's going to be pregnant soon? I mean, it's not only about stereotypes. It's about if you only give maternity leave and do not give paternity leave, then there's going to create this imbalance. So that's why it's so important that it's actually family leave and that men also take leave when a baby is born. Yeah. That from the very beginning, the fathers also feel responsible. It's not that only the mothers can breastfeed, but the fathers are also needed to take care of the babies from the very beginning. And so that has a direct effect on economic life because unfortunately, and here particularly in Ukraine, unemployment for women of childbearing age is very high because there's this idea that women have to stay at home and take care of the children while the man can continue working. But then after that, if the woman has stayed home for 3 years taking care of the children, it's going to be extremely difficult for her to reintegrate economic life and to move up in the business. So that's why it's so important that at this stage of life that men and women share the responsibilities.
Гаразд. Наступне питання задовге, тому я його прочитаю. Чому всі розвинені країни наголошують на розширенні прав і можливостей жінок у соціальній, економічній, політичній, культурній та багатьох інших сферах життя, та які практичні кроки та заходи слід вживати для сприйняття розширенню прав і можливостей жінок в Україні?
So, what you suggested is that many countries are trying to advance gender equality and women empowerment. First, I would like to say that yes, there are countries that are trying to advance gender equality and women empowerment, but unfortunately, we're also seeing a backlash. So we're also seeing in many countries that women are actually losing some of their rights. You mentioned earlier in the program the situation in Russia, for example. As we know, in Russia, domestic violence is no longer criminalized. So they actually change the law so that those who perpetuate domestic violence are no longer considered criminals. It's not only in Russia. I mean, we see other countries where this kind of backlash is happening, where we're actually seeing going backwards and where actually women are losing their rights. So it is still very much a struggle to ensure gender equality and women's empowerment. There are, of course, different ways to advance it. As we've already discussed during this program, violence is a key issue. So addressing violence and ensuring that violence is criminalized, ensuring that those who do violence, that they're considered criminals and that they spend time in jail, that those who are survivors, that they are protected, that the children are protected. All of these things are key aspects where Ukraine is making progress on all of these issues. But then there are other areas which really, in all spheres of life, gender equality comes up. So we talked about economic empowerment, and I mentioned a couple of times already equal pay. The issue of equal pay is a problem in the European Union as well. So it's still almost impossible to find a situation where men and women are paid the same amount for the same work. And this is still a struggle in European Union countries as well, to ensure that that men and women are paid the same amount for equal work. So that's one key area that is of much interest today, particularly in the European Union. The other thing that we talked about is women participating in decision making. So that is also a key issue, even in the European Union. So, for example, one of the most recent pieces of legislation in the European Union has to do with women on boards. So the boards of companies around the world, even in the European Union, the number of women on boards is significantly less than men. So it's usually about a 20% or 30%. So here in the European Union, they've agreed that they will try to get closer to equality of men and women on boards. The issue of women in politics, as we said, is still a problem as well. Here in Ukraine, only 21% of the parliamentarians are women. So what we saw in the last elections is that at the local level, there were quotas that were put into place. So to ensure that women were on the electoral list, I think it was at 40% compared to men. And so we saw that the use of quotas helped increase the number of women in local councils and in regional councils. So that will be very important also when eventually the discussion turns to elections in Ukraine, to ensure that quotas, or what we call temporary special measures, are put in place to increase the number of women in parliament, because 18% is 21% is very, very low. So here it's also important to take measures to ensure that women are equally represented in government. So, for example, in the cabinet, in Ukraine, we have 5 cabinet members out of 22 cabinet members that are women. So that's also, far from equality. Ukraine has taken a lot of key steps to help advance gender equality and women empowerment. One of the very important things is that it ratified the Istanbul Convention from the Council of Europe in 2022. That was very important. So we're seeing that Ukraine is taking key steps in terms of laws, but there's still some more to be done. And I would say here, one of the very interesting topics is issues of financing. So, of course, the state budget and local and regional budgets are developed. One thing that we say at UN Women is that it's very important to look at how those budgets are going to support women and girls. So are they gender responsive? Having gender responsive budgets ensures that the funding that comes from the state is also specifically supporting women and girls. And so here, Ukraine has done some work on gender responsive budgeting. And of course, the budget situation today is extremely difficult, but there's also room to think about, for example, for the recovery process, how are we going to ensure a recovery which is actually inclusive, which is equal for women and men. And so there are quite a lot of interesting things right now that Ukraine is thinking about, and that definitely should be supported.
І що ми можемо зробити для більшого залучення жінок у політику під час війни та відновлення України?
So what we see is that women have played incredibly important roles already, especially since February 2022 and the start of the large-scale aggression by Russia. What we've seen is that women have played incredible roles in women's rights organizations, in civil society organizations, and NGOs. You'll remember back in March and April 2022 when there were large flows of internally displaced persons that were moving to Western Ukraine. It was a lot of women's organizations that welcomed those displaced persons, that took care of them at the very beginning. Really, Ukraine now, I think, is known for being a country where women's rights organizations stood up and helped with the resistance and helped with the support particularly to internally displaced persons. But it's not only a civil society. Of course, what we've seen is that women are actively involved in the fighting. The estimates are about 6,000 women that are on the front line fighting, and approximately 50,000 women in the army altogether. So women are actively, equally fighting in defense of their territory. And then, of course, what we also see is that women are doing a huge amount within their communities, in frontline areas where their services are not working as well. Women have to take care of their children, they have to take care of their elderly, they have to take care of disabled persons. So what we're really seeing is that women are really rising up to the occasion and taking on new roles. What I think is going to be really interesting now and in the coming years is the role of women in economic life, because women are increasingly involved in economics as well. There is an estimate that in the past year, with the new businesses that are created, was that 1 out of every 2 new businesses was actually led by a woman. So we at UN Women are doing programming to support women as entrepreneurs, to help give them some of the skills and confidence and even some financing to start their own businesses. Also, women will be needed in all types of jobs. They will be needed in jobs that they didn't do traditionally, things like demining, things like transportation, energy, building. There'll be a lot of opportunities for women to take on new jobs. In some ways, hopefully, amidst this huge tragedy that everybody's living through in Ukraine, this can also be an opportunity for women to take on new roles and to gain basically new powers to reduce these inequalities that we've been talking about during this program.
Власне, я думаю, це всі питання, можливо, ми про щось забули. Дякую за відповіді і за пояснення. Гадаю, наша розмова стане корисною для суспільства і зможе змінити щось у головах тих, хто досі не вірить в гендерну рівність.
Fyodor, thank you so much for having me on today as well. And thank you, tremendous to Ukrainska Pravda for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about these topics. Unfortunately, they're very difficult topics. They're topics that require a lot of thinking and reflection. But I'm very happy that I was able to come here today and to be able to explain a little bit more about the root causes of gender equality, and really to emphasize that Ukraine is doing a tremendous amount and is making big progress on reducing inequality. Unfortunately, many of these things are difficult and will take time. But it's great to see, particularly a younger generation who's interested in addressing this inequality. And I think, I think that there's great potential to ensure that there will be less violence and there will be less inequality over the coming years. So thank you very much.
Отже, сподіваюсь, вам було цікаво, і ще більше сподіваюся, що ви, як і я, знаходите цю тему важливою. Ще раз нагадую, що цей епізод було записано в межах проєкту EU for Recovery – розширення можливостей громад в Україні, який впроваджується ООН «Жінки в Україні» за підтримки Європейського Союзу.